I must, for myself, examine the reasons I left the comfort of Kuldahar for a journey to Deepingdale, the place of Isilor's birth. It is much like the assignments given to me by Uncle Oswald and Isilor himself. When Isilor left those lands near the Inner Sea for the spine of the world, he told his fellow druids he would send a student to replace him. This, I told myself, was why I left. But now, as I sit by the warmth of a fire in Mirabar, I realize what Isilor must have already known. I remember the details vividly. It started many years ago.
Greetings everyone, I am Dr. J and welcome to Through the Looking Glass, where I look at old games I haven't played before to see if they hold up. After beginning to examine the Infinity Engine games with Baldur's Gate so long ago, it's time to close out this tale with the last one that was released, Icewind Dale 2. Following the success of Icewind Dale, the sequel would follow much the same pattern, allowing you to create your entire party right from the start, and maintaining a focus on combat. However, this time around, instead of implementing D&D's 2nd edition rule set, the game would be using the 3rd edition, adding a substantial number of changes that would shake up how you set up and use your characters. Though little would change with the core gameplay, this change would theoretically allow for more variety within your party, and therefore more reason to play it multiple times. However, going into this, I'll admit to being nervous, as my last foray into these games was less than complimentary. Though I liked Icewind Dale's story and could appreciate some of the more unique encounters, the game was kneecapped for me due to the generic writing and the fact that in order to get to those unique encounters, you have to wade through a ton of repetitive ones. I still stand by what I said in my review, but I'll admit that to an extent, the game was doomed from the start. Back then, I was trying to do Let's Plays of the games I reviewed, in part to help me sift through footage and to show how I came to my conclusion in real time. It may have worked out fine for the other Infinity Engine games, with Baldur's Gate featuring characters I already knew from the sequel, and Planescape Torment having some of the best writing I've ever seen, but in the case of Icewind Dale, it only ended up cementing a lot of the writing and gameplay issues I mentioned, to a degree where I was probably harsher on the game than I would have been otherwise. Even if you take that out of the equation, I had begun playing it almost immediately after playing Baldur's Gate 2 and Planescape Torment, which meant any issues in the writing and gameplay would have been easier to spot. And after a massive change of pace from 2 other RPGs I had picked up around that time, Icewind Dale already had an uphill battle just to be considered decent, let alone good. Thus, I decided to give some distance to Icewind Dale 2, so as to partially reset my expectations and to give me some time to see to other games. I'll admit that I spent more time away than I expected, courtesy of a certain game that took way too long to finish talking about, but given this was the last one and the only one I hadn't played yet, it's about time I brought some closure to the topic. So the question is, was this foray a welcome improvement or a bitter disappointment? Let's find out. With this being a game that puts heavy emphasis on gameplay, let's start there. If you've played one of the Infinity Engine games or the 3rd edition rule set of D&D, you'll be pretty much at home here. If you have no experience with either, as with the previous game, you are likely better off starting off with one of this game's predecessors, as while they make it a little easier to get into, courtesy of some pre-made teams, there's still a lot to figure out right off the bat. Still, if you are coming from a previous game, let's take a brief moment to detail what's different between the 2nd and 3rd editions. The primary differences are how races, classes, skills, and proficiency are handled. Where the races are concerned, more of them have been added, such as Aasimar and Tiefling, while others have had sub-races added to them, with the differences between Drow and other kinds of elves now extending to the rule set itself instead of just how they're usually played. Where classes are concerned, you now have a lot more freedom in your ability to multi-class, though this still comes with some restrictions. Now instead of evenly dividing experience between a dual class, you instead choose which class to level up in once you're able, meaning the choice on what you want to focus on is now more deliberate. Also, you have some restrictions built into the classes themselves. For paladins and monks, there are very few, if any, classes you can invest levels into without losing the ability to progress the original class, and there are still some classes which are mutually exclusive. They've also added a distinction between sorcerers and wizards, which takes somewhat different approaches to spellcasting. The wizard has a wider variety of spells at his disposal, while the sorcerer doesn't need to worry about learning spells from a scroll and can usually cast them more often. As for skills, they've added what are called feats to handle weapon proficiency and special abilities that are used to distinguish different units. Where weapon proficiency is concerned, it's become more specific, with virtually every weapon getting its own kind of proficiency that you have to directly invest in. And even within a given weapon type, you can still have a distinction, such as the difference between a longsword and a bastard sword. You can still attack with a weapon you're not proficient in, but this will lead to a penalty on your attack rolls. As for other feats, they offer benefits such as increased dodge chance against missile weapons, a greater likelihood that your spell won't get interrupted if you take damage while casting it, and improved proficiency at various skills. Speaking of which, those skills have been expanded to cover various checks that allow other classes to assist with tasks, such as surveying an area for druids, diplomacy and persuasion for paladins and bards, as well as other skills such as using magical tools, disarming traps, and so on and so forth. And if that's a lot to take in, that's the point of listing them out in such a hurry, because as someone who hasn't looked at the 3rd edition rule set in years, it was a lot to take in all at once. Luckily, by picking a pre-made team at the start, I could sidestep the character creation phase, but even then it's a lot to consider, and I only really got a grip on what was possible by the 10-hour mark. Speaking of those pre-made teams, their inclusion is definitely welcome. Whereas before each class got their own specific backstory, each of the characters in a given team received something more specific, which may not have had much of an impact on the story, but is certainly appreciated. The one I chose for my playthrough was the Winter's Rose, which is a pretty well-rounded team that may be lacking in a way to resurrect fallen characters, but offers a lot when it comes to frontline engagements, ranged weapons, spell work. Pretty much everything I needed to do well was built in from the start. In fact, I suspect that's why the game's combat seems more balanced than last time, as with these pre-made teams in mind, they could give the developers an idea as to the expected baseline, while still allowing people who wanted to min-max a chance to specialize to their heart's content. I did go back through later to see how character creation works, and compared to what I'm used to, it's pretty much standard fare, with options nested into each other sensibly, and with enough detail in the description to where it was easy to get a sense for how they would play. Getting into the combat, there was one primary concern I had going into it, specifically my criticism of the original game. Back then, there were a deluge of generic encounters that were present not necessarily to challenge you, but to ensure you had enough experience to take on the set pieces, which led the game to be very tedious at times. And not only was it a lot of generic encounters, there was seldom any variety within a given map, as you would have the area filled with lizard men, the area filled with undead, the area filled with ice-based creatures, rinse and repeat endlessly. So going into this, I expected something fairly similar. A lot of generic encounters before they had their set pieces, with those set pieces being the main attraction. And at first, it seemed like they were gonna fall into this trap, up until they threw the defense of a village in my face and said, hey, you know how you expected them all to be goblins? Well, there's actually quite a bit of variety with these goblins now, as we've got them outfitted with different weapons, some of them are riding wargs, and even these shaman that show up to cause you different kinds of trouble. Also, you don't have time to rest, so you better make use of everything you've got or else you're not gonna be having a good time. This game made an encounter against freaking goblins, an encounter you fight within the first 3 hours, an interesting fight. Goblins, of all things, being made into a worthy opponent that keeps me on my toes throughout the entire thing. Even better, it's a trend that they maintain throughout much of the game's runtime, as the enemy variety is much better than it was before. Now instead of just getting rooms of the same enemies, they vary up the enemies not just between individual encounters, but within the same one. Meaning my usual one-size-fits-all strategizing didn't usually work without some variation. However, it doesn't entirely escape the problem, with the worst case showing up in Chapter 5. It starts out promising as you clear out a horde of undead and Yuan-Ti from friendly territory. But then, despite the differences in appearance, you have a map full of Yuan-Ti, a temple filled with Yuan-Ti, a level that technically threw different kinds of reptiles at me, another level below full of Yuan-Ti, and I think you can guess what the next level also had in store for me. They had minor variations, occasionally throwing spiders, golems, or some other enemy in my way, but it was usually a small blip on the radar compared to the deluge of serpent spawn you had to deal with throughout, a fact which on its own made my progress slow down to a crawl. What's worse is that this is on top of another problem with respect to the game's pacing, the times when the story would interject. Before I say too much, I will admit that I'm someone who plays CRPGs primarily for their story, which is another reason why the first Icewind Dale didn't impress me as much. However, while it might not be the primary focus, it does still receive a decent amount of attention, which means in pretty much every map there's something there to break up the flow of gameplay. For some levels though, it seems that there's usually only 1 or 2 interesting story bits, meaning you have this bloody massive map with dangerous encounters throughout, and the only thing offering context is a small blip on the map and the overarching objective. For the most part, the enemy variety is enough to mask over this, with the exception of Chapter 5, but what makes it stand out is how it compares to the first and final chapters. Both sections are close to perfection for what I want from a CRPG. For the first chapter, the combat remains very closely tied to the events of the story, with weaker encounters used to ratchet up the tension for when things get serious, and when the gameplay really picks up, it's more worthwhile because of the contrast between and build up from those quieter moments. For the last chapter, I went in expecting it to be the same minor variations on a theme from the previous chapter, just with a different enemy type. As a result, imagine my surprise when, after the initial 2 fights, I walk around, and there's no combat. Thanks to how the story plays out, there's a way to progress without just murdering everyone in sight. There are some jarring moments when combat does start up, but there's encouragement to explore, to get to know the place, to keep track of these different characters and their conflicting motivations, and when the combat starts back up, it's some of the best in the entire game. Even for the really dangerous battles, there were legitimate means to make it easier to take them on, whether it be based in actions you take before the battle or simply by engaging in cheese. Because if a big bad isn't gonna follow me downstairs, please excuse me while I periodically go down there to heal my paladin, and then go back up to spam high-level projectiles and lightning spells. The final section was so good, I spent nearly 6 hours with the game over the course of a single day. And if the entire game were like that last chapter, I'd have nary a complaint. Before we move on to the story and presentation, there are a couple other things worth mentioning. First off, the distance away from the genre has also reminded me of just how much there is to keep track of within it. I had taken it for granted before, but I'm starting to realize why people aren't fans of real-time with pause, especially since modern CRPGs have typically left it behind. Once you get to later chapters, where you have massive spell lists, different modifiers you activate right before combat, every little way you can incrementally increase your damage or defense, it's a min-maxer's dream. But it's also a lot to juggle in your mind at once. It's something that I don't mind for the most part, outside of how long it takes to sort your inventory, but it is something to remember if you haven't played one of these games recently. Second, to help break up the flow of combat, they also throw in some puzzle-solving sections, which usually aren't very complex or difficult, but help each area to stand out more. Whether it be a small riddle in order to get to a mage tower, or a block puzzle where you're periodically ambushed by barbarians, they are a welcome sight, even if 1 or 2 of them can be a little more obtuse than you might like. To further help different areas stand out, the art and music are once again really well done. It reuses some of Jeremy Soul's tracks from the first Icewind Dale, but also introduces new ones from a composer called Enon Zor, who had previously done work for Baldur's Gate 2 Throne of Bhaal. It can be a little distracting to go between their music, as while they're both orchestral, they take somewhat different approaches to it. Still, the new introductions remain well orchestrated, and underscore some of the best combat the game has, so my only complaint pertains to how frequently it's heard. As with the first game, the tracks only seem to trigger at certain points, which means you can go for a long period of time with only the ambience as background noise, which can make some of the areas feel strangely empty. Perhaps I got spoiled by Baldur's Gate 2 always having some kind of music in the background, and it isn't as noticeable this time around, but there are points where I would have expected music to play where it sadly doesn't. As for the artwork, I got a lot of feedback on the last video for not spending more time discussing it, and not without reason. A game's appearance can do a lot to sell the atmosphere of a game and communicate a location's history, with it being the main way to distinguish different areas. And as before, it's really well made, with a lot of detail put into it to where your mind is easily fooled into believing it's a 3D space instead of a 2D image. The screen can sometimes get cluttered given the number of enemies they throw at you, not that a good fireball or ice storm can't solve the problem, but the artwork itself is really well done. The only problem I have with the appearance boils down to the user interface, as instead of using the U-shaped border from the game's predecessor, they opt to use a similar interface to Planescape Torment. And unlike that game, the icons down here aren't as intuitive. Sure, you've got the bag and sword for inventory, the compass for the map, the checkmark for the options menu, but even after spending over 50 hours with this game, I still get the character screen, journal, and spellbook confused, because simply creating 3 different appearances for paper is totally going to be enough to distinguish them. Is this one the journal because it's where we write down new information, the character sheet for when we level up and add new abilities, or the spellbook for the process of copying spells into it? I suppose I could look at the manual for this one, especially since the GOG version comes with it, but even then, unless I want to print it out, the game refuses to let me alt-tab out of it. And since my cursor will slide up the screen into my second monitor if I don't disable it, I'm stuck just clicking the buttons until I remember which one is which. Point being, this is one time where it may have been better to focus on functionality over aesthetics, as while it would have clashed with the current UI's appearance, Planescape Torment helped distinguish them by changing the color underneath the icons, which would have been really helpful here. Also, by compressing everything into the bottom of the screen, you also greatly reduce how much shows up in the chat window, which means searching for specific names to see whether an attack I used actually had an effect or not is next to impossible, because good luck finding it between all the other actions that were taken in that time. It was already difficult enough as it is, but with how many enemies get thrown at you this time around, it's really noticeable now. Fortunately for this game, the UI is still usable enough even if it is basic or obtuse by modern standards, and with how good the combat itself is, it's normally enough to overlook. For me, however, the real draw of a CRPG is its story, so how well does it hold up? Overall, I'd consider it to be about on par with the first Icewind Dale, maybe a little better. What was great about Icewind Dale is that you didn't quite know who your enemy was, merely that there was something ominous on the periphery that had the potential to destroy the 10 towns of Icewind Dale, which added a nice mystery element. However, before you even reach the halfway mark of this game, you know what you're up against, which means instead of giving us intrigue by discovering more about the underlying threat, the intrigue comes from ascertaining the bad guys' motivations and history, figuring out who they've allied with and how such alliances were forged. In that regard, it's a more straightforward tale, but still an interesting one. You could ding them for having yet another crisis threatening the 10 towns, but considering how different the source of the trouble is this time, and the manner in which it's resolved, it's easy to accept it as its own thing. Especially since the 30-year gap between this game and the previous means they don't overly distract you with references to previous events. If you've never played the first Icewind Dale, you can jump straight into this and still have a good grasp of what's going on. And if you have played it, it's still nice to see familiar faces and locations in a very different circumstance. More importantly, my primary issue with the first game's story, namely the writing, has been greatly improved. They still do lean on generic D&D terminology a little too much, using words like item as a shorthand that could mean far too many things, but it happens a lot less frequently this time. Instead, there's a lot more personality put into the dialogue, which helps each character stand out more and helps make the world worth exploring. Add on to that characters who differ more in terms of personality and speech pattern, with excellent voice acting whenever it appears, and you've got a story that's basic but does what it sets out to do, and is one I can appreciate as a result. Overall, Icewind Dale 2 is exactly what I wanted from the first game. I may not play CRPGs for the combat, but this one ensured that the majority of the encounters were memorable by doing a lot more to vary up the enemy composition and, by virtue of that, the tactics required to win. For that alone, if you are the kind of person that likes CRPGs for their combat, this is a must-own. As for the story, I'd put it at about the same level as the first game, as while the writing doesn't hamstring it as much, the circumstances are more straightforward this time. So your investment in it will come down to how interested you are in the characters you meet, which I personally liked. With all of that said, even if I had played this immediately after its predecessor, I suspect I would have still had a decent time, as while it only comes close to Baldur's Gate 2 during the final chapter, it was still worth it to finish out the franchise. If you're interested, you can find it over on GOG. Just bear in mind that if you're looking for an enhanced edition, this is the one Infinity Engine game for which that will never arrive, as the source code for the game is sadly lost to time. Part of me is disappointed by that since the game would greatly benefit from it, but at the same time, Beamdog also made the decision to prevent you from buying the original version separately from their enhanced editions. Sure, they may be objectively better from a technical standpoint, but if you would rather just play the original version, that means you spend a little more toward a company who didn't make the originals. It's not the most important issue to be fought when it comes to consumer choice, but it does rub me the wrong way. And the fact that it isn't present in this case means I don't have to give that caveat if you're trying it out for the first time. With that out of the way, that's all I have for this video. Thank you all for watching. Please like and share this if you find it deserving, and subscribe to this channel for more reviews as well as other content posted on a semi-regular basis. And man, does it feel good to be back in the saddle for Through the Looking Glass, as it's been far too long since I reviewed a game for this series. I can technically file what I'm working on for Halo the Master Chief Collection in there, but given that it's a long-term project all on its own, I'm not sure I really count that. For now though, I've got plenty of other games in my backlog to see to, so for now, thank you once again for watching, let me know what you think in the comments below, and I'll see you all next time.